With the bye weeks, I have been asked some disgusting start sit questions here at running back. Hopefully the rankings can help you out. Tier 1, obviously, nobody's asking about these guys. You know you start Barkley, Henry, Kyron, Kamara, Achane, Bijan. And honestly, starting off in Tier 2, you can make an argument to throw these guys into the first tier as well. Each one of them individually maybe has a red flag or two. The red flag that we have with Breece is we have seen a lower floor with Breece Hall than we have the other elite running backs so far this season, where you are looking at 3 games with fewer than 10 fantasy points. Obviously, we've had these one-off games where Braylon Allen has a role, where Braylon Allen scores a touchdown or two. This matchup against Arizona is great. I still think Breece is a mid RB1 that you start every single week. Joe Mixon typically is a tier 1 running back for us. Last week, we had him as a tier 2 option if you were looking at the implied team total for Houston and a tougher matchup going up against the Jets. It kind of made sense to not necessarily put Mixon up there in the same range as Kyron and Alvin Kamara. And I would reiterate the same thing this week. This week, you have an implied team total of about 22 points here for Houston. So it should be about an average offense that typically wants to run the ball over and over and over again with Mixon, where if you're going to go through and look at the games where Mixon's played fully healthy, you've seen 30, 13, 25, 25, and 24 rush attempts. So usually he's a tier 1 option. Just this week, it's a very tough matchup that you have going up against Detroit, where we know Detroit really wants to shut down the opposing team's running back. Our next option will be Jahmyr Gibbs. With Gibbs, very rarely are we going to throw him in there at tier 1 unless you have a phenomenal matchup. This matchup against Houston, definitely not a bad one, right? Gibbs hasn't particularly had a ton of opportunities. It's just that he's been one of the most efficient running backs in the entire NFL, running behind one of the best offensive lines. If you're looking at the opportunities over the past month or so, you're seeing 13, 12, 19, 17. Really, you've only had one game with 20 opportunities or more, and that was 20 opportunities back in week 2 against Tampa, where obviously you did have Detroit getting to a shootout. And then we are going to go Jonathan Taylor in here at 10. Now, Taylor actually has a pretty tough matchup going up against Buffalo. Obviously, this entire Colts offense was very disappointing in a tough matchup against Minnesota last week. What I was actually surprised to see, though, is the underdog pick'em with Jonathan Taylor right now has him like higher, lower 110 total yards. You did see actually 5 targets out of the backfield with Flacco under center, and that is going to be a big change that you have from Anthony Richardson to Flacco, right? Is that you are going to have more checkdowns overall going in the direction of Jonathan Taylor. Now, going down to our next tier, we're going to have Aaron Jones in a phenomenal matchup here against Jacksonville. Jacksonville's had one of the worst defenses so far this season. If you're looking at the Vikings, they are heavily favored in this game. They have an implied team total of almost 26 points. So you presumably can see the Vikings consistently run the ball in the second half. If you're looking at the opportunities we've seen since the bye week with Jones, you've had 17, 21, and 25, obviously including the usage that you've had as a receiver. It's a really strong matchup. He's getting used on all 3 downs. And honestly, I think you could see some positive touchdown regression here for Jones soon as well. Chase Brown will be our next back. Now, it's not like opposing teams have had issues scoring against Baltimore this season, but what's surprising is the spread on this game going up against the Ravens is up at almost 7 points. It's like a touchdown spread. Sportsbooks are telling us that the Ravens should just absolutely smoke the Bengals. The Bengals only with an implied team total of 23 points. Now, of course, you have no Zach Moss, but you do have Khalil Herbert coming in. But it's a short week. They're telling us Khalil Herbert can play, but it almost seems like that's probably going to be just in case anything happens to Brown. While it definitely does maybe make a slight impact in terms of the long term that we should expect with the Brown workload for Herbert to be in this backfield, I think Herbert was brought in more so for depth reasons, because if you go through and look at the depth chart beyond Chase Brown and Zach Moss, it's probably one of the thinnest running back rooms in the league. So I think Chase Brown dominates with a 3-down workload. If you're actually looking at his underdog pick'em this week, I wouldn't mind going with the higher than on Chase Brown's total yards. Now, obviously, a lot of this has to do with the game environment and why I'm not going all in. But right now, he is higher, lower, 88.5 total yards, even odds to score a touchdown. But if you think the Bengals can be competitive in this game, that probably does look very appealing to take the higher. And if you wanted to over there on Underdog Fantasy, you can find that link in the description and comment section. Code FLOCK's going to hook you up with a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll get a free Lamar Jackson pick, more than less than half a total yard for the game tonight. And you'll get a free team review in the live stream we are doing every single night as well. Now, moving over to our next tier, we're going to be led off with James Cook. Obviously, Ray Davis had the long receiving touchdown. Ray Davis took the majority of the points in this backfield last week. But the reality is the underlying usage still boosts up James Cook. James Cook had 16 opportunities, including 6 targets out of the backfield. He's still the guy in the red zone that's going to get the work. So James Cook, still a running back with touchdown upside, receiving upside in a very good offense. And it's a decent matchup going up against Indy, where presumably Buffalo can run the ball in the second half. A team that's definitely going to run the ball over and over and over again will be the Los Angeles Chargers with J.K. Dobbins. If you look at over the past 5 games, we've only seen one game with fewer than 70% of the snaps for J.K. Dobbins in this offense. He has taken over as one of the true 3-down bell cow backs. On top of this, you have a matchup against Tennessee, where right now this is about a touchdown spread where the Chargers are heavily favored here. And at the same time, we're getting some usage as a receiver. So Dobbins, zero hesitation, must start back. Obviously, David Montgomery's been phenomenal. David Montgomery only has 1 game this season with fewer than 10 fantasy points. Yeah, he didn't score a touchdown this past week, but you still get the 20 opportunities out of this backfield against Green Bay in a game environment where you actually didn't have much, specifically from Jahmyr Gibbs. This game going up against Houston, the Lions are favored, of course. So presumably they should be able to run the ball in the second half, and still one of the best offensive lines, if not the best offensive line in the NFL. DeAndre Swift will be our next name. With DeAndre Swift, 22 opportunities this past week, 18 the week prior, 21 the week before that, 23. The man's a true 3-down workhorse. Plus, this is a really strong matchup going up against New England, where this is one of the very few game environments and where the Bears are going to be about touchdown favorites. So this is a spot where you may not see a ton of Roschon Johnson, where obviously Roschon would be the back if the Bears fall behind dramatically. He's getting on the field because he's a great pass blocker. It seems like they'll probably be able to control the game with DeAndre Swift, and you have 2 good matchups left for Swift until you get to the gauntlet of teams where it is very concerning. Christian McCaffrey will be our next player. With CMC, just want to put it out there, he's a must-start running back. Okay, obviously, we are lowering expectations with his first week back in. His first week back in, I'm not expecting him to be a tier 1 option and the best player in fantasy football. I would imagine that they slowly incorporate him into this offense, and then he sees more and more work as time goes on. It's a really strong matchup here going up against Tampa. You're already seeing his underdog pick'em be higher, lower, 76.5 rushing yards. And obviously, you know that he's going to have the receiving usage. So if you have McCaffrey and you're really nervous to play him, I would play him. And if you think he's going to do bad, I'd just take the lower than 76.5 rushing yards on underdog. I'm going over to Kareem Hunt. Kareem Hunt, 20 opportunities in every single game. He's been the starter here in KC. The matchup against Denver's not great, but I mean, you do have KC, of course, as heavy favorites here, about touchdown favorites over the Broncos. But looking at the carries that you've had from Kareem Hunt here in KC, you've seen 27, 22, 21, and 27. Now, it seems like you're getting a very high floor, maybe a little bit of a cap ceiling, because obviously the breakaway runs haven't been there for Kareem Hunt. At this point of his career, they probably won't be. What's a little more interesting to point out is the fact that you really haven't had any receiving usage either. Now, going over to our next running back in this tier, we're going to be looking at James Conner. Against the Bears, James Conner only played 48% of the snaps. You actually had 3 rushing touchdowns. James Conner saw 0 of them. So maybe that usage scares you off of James Conner. Maybe you think that the veteran is actually losing ground to what you have with the younger options here, such as Trey Benson. But the reality is, at least in my mind, this wasn't a real football game against the Chicago Bears. This was a game where Arizona led from start to finish. This is a game where, of course, they didn't necessarily need to lean on James Conner. So in what should be presumably a more competitive contest going up against the Jets, I think we see James Conner play significantly more snaps and get back to what we saw a little bit closer to like the Chargers game and what you had with the Miami game. Now, dropping down to our next tier, Tyrone Tracy obviously was a sell-high candidate for us 2 weeks back, coming off the monstrous 23-point performance in primetime against a great Steelers defense. But I do want to stand by. Tyrone Tracy is still a must-start running back. I know he's very disappointing with only 7 fantasy points this past week. I know he still doesn't really have much receiving usage. But this week in particular, you're going up against the Carolina Panthers. You actually have an implied team total of about 24 points for this Giants offense. A lot of this has to do with the fact that this is probably the best matchup you could ever draw if you are a running back. So there should be points scored in their offense, more than you're typically used to here for the Giants. Tracy doesn't really have much usage as a receiver still. I mean, you haven't seen him have more than 10 receiving yards since week 6, but it doesn't matter. The matchup's too good. You have to go ahead and start him. Tony Pollard, I think you could actually move up these rankings a bit if Tajee Spears doesn't play. Obviously, since you've had no Spears, Pollard has just been a monster with the volume that he has had. I mean, really over the past 5 weeks, really all season, this man, every single week seeing 20 plus opportunities. Now, of course, with that being said, you're in a garbage offense. Specifically this week against the Chargers, sportsbooks are actually projecting out the Tennessee Titans to be the worst offense in the NFL with only about a 15.5 point implied team total here. Now, Brian Robinson Jr. will be our next option. Looking at Robinson, obviously missed against the Giants. He was at practice on Wednesday. It seemed like he was going to play last week, so expectation is that Brian Robinson's probably back in this week, most likely with very little to no limitations. But it is going to be a tough matchup going up against Pittsburgh. And of course, I wouldn't mind if you wanted to wait a week and just confirm that he is good to go. Ramondre Stevenson will be our next running back. I thank God started Ramondre last week. I mean, it turned out to not be enough. But again, I want to reiterate, in these game environments where it'll be close for the New England Patriots, Ramondre Stevenson has performed well all season. Like, we can go through and we can just go game by game here and look at the games in which Ramondre has played well and the games in which Ramondre has performed poorly. The first game of the season, you get 21 points, and that's when the Patriots beat the Bengals. The second game of the season, we get 17 points, and that's when they go to overtime with the Seahawks. Then after that, the next 3 weeks, they get blown out by the Jets, they get blown out by the Niners, they lose to the Dolphins, and the only game where Ramondre performed well was the game against the Dolphins, where it was a 5-point contest. Then afterwards, the game against Jacksonville, obviously the Patriots get blown out. Ramondre does nothing. Now, over the past 2 weeks, the Patriots win a game, and then they lose a game by 3, and Ramondre Stevenson's great. It's very simple. If the Patriots play a competitive game, Ramondre Stevenson's been great in fantasy. If the Patriots get blown out, Ramondre Stevenson is a dud. Now, of course, you have more hope with this offense going into the future with Drake May under center as opposed to what you had specifically with Jacoby Brissett. But keeping that in mind, this is still a situation in which you do have the Patriots as about touchdown dogs here. So it's not a super easy situation to just go through and say Ramondre's a must-start player. Now, Najee Harris will be our next option. If we're looking at Najee Harris, back-to-back weeks with Russell Wilson, he's been phenomenal. He's had 3 weeks straight with over 100 rushing yards. Now, at the same time, if we are looking at what you've had since Jaylen Warren's been back in this offense, you do have Najee Harris averaging fewer than 10 receiving yards per game. So with Warren in, the receiving usage is going to go down. This matchup against Washington, obviously the Commanders are favored. So for me, I just traded for Najee Harris from Sal, effectively going through, giving him Javonte for Najee, Ladd for Metcalf, and then a little bit of extra juice on top of it. So I'm definitely excited to have Najee Harris over Javonte Williams. But like, I'm looking at him this week and going, you know what, in a full PPR format, I don't even know if I'm excited to play the dude. I'd almost rather throw Jalen Waddle into my second flex spot. Now, I'm trying to behave myself. We are probably planning on playing Najee Harris this week, but your boy's not in love with it. Now, dropping down to our next tier, I'm not in love with playing Chuba Hubbard either. Obviously, with Hubbard, he's been an absolute must-start running back every single week over the past, really, 2 months or so. You've had all the volume. He's a top 10 running back so far this season in total points scored. Now, with this being said, you finally have Jonathan Brooks activated off the IR. Jonathan Brooks was practicing in full last week. We thought it was going to happen in week 9, but no, it was pushed a week and it happened in week 10. Now, you can clearly tell by these rankings that my expectation, especially in the short term, will be Chuba Hubbard's the guy, but it's a running back by committee and one of the worst offenses in the league. So even if Chuba Hubbard's the RB1 in this backfield, if Jonathan Brooks has a role, which I expect him to, I don't know how excited we are about Hubbard in a timeshare with Bryce Young under center. Rico Dowdle will be our next option. Obviously, we had Dowdle as the buy low candidate a few weeks back. I feel really good about that call. I didn't think it was definitely the correct one, especially what we see with this game against Atlanta. But the issue is projecting this going into the future now. Now you have no Dak Prescott. Typically, we are used to seeing the Dallas Cowboys project out to score 24, 25 points any given week. And now that projection has actually been lowered down to 17 with their implied team total this week. So it is a much tougher spot to go through and say that Rico Dowdle's a must start back. It's a very tough spot to say that Rachaad White's a must start running back. Obviously, we had him as the sell high candidate last week. He still comes through and saves the day with the rushing touchdown, but I feel pretty good about calling him the sell high candidate because honestly, you had 3 carries this past week against KC. You only had 3 targets. You had 6 opportunities for Rachaad White. Bucky Irving has a role. They're getting Sean Tucker a little bit involved as well. I know a lot of people want to scream at me that Rachaad White is a must-start player because with the Godwin and Evans injuries, he has some massive roles as a receiver. But the reality is, when you're coming off a game with 6 opportunities as a running back, I'm not super confident to put you in my lineup. It's a tough matchup going up against the Niners. It's an even tougher matchup for Javonte Williams going up against the Chiefs. Again, I just sold Javonte in the Flock League. Feel very good about getting out of Javonte Williams. We have this coaching staff in Denver coming out saying that they're going to be using Audric Estime a little bit more going into the future. Now, of course, it's not like Estime's the starter. You can tell by these rankings, we're expecting that to be Javonte Williams. But if all of a sudden you expect Javonte to be in a running back by committee where he wasn't getting the job done previously, I think it is very concerning. Now, I also want to point out that I know a lot of people got excited about Bo Nix. A lot of people got excited about this offense here in Denver when they played the freaking New Orleans Saints with nobody healthy and when they played the Carolina Panthers. But realistically speaking, this is still a bad offense. Looking at the projection this week, you have an implied team total of about 16.5 points. So I'm not excited to really play anybody here in Denver, especially not the running backs. Now, beyond this, like, good freaking luck if you have to start any of these RBs. Like, I'm praying to God that you don't. We'll have Mostert where you're just sending up a prayer that you get a rushing touchdown. We'll have Brooks. Brooks is a running back that maybe you can be excited about in the long term, but to start him this week would just be absolute garbage. You have Jordan Mason, where I just don't know how to rank Jordan Mason right now. Obviously, we're waiting for CMC and Mason updates. We have Bucky Irving in a tough matchup. We have Travis Etienne, Austin Eckler, Tank Bigsby. And then the tier below this is like the premium handcuffs that I definitely want to have on my roster, but you're really only rostering them in case an injury occurs in front of them, such as Davis, Roshan, Algier, and Braylon Allen. But yeah, please, please, please tell me you're not having to start anybody in these bottom 2 tiers. But I really appreciate you. Really hope I was able to help you out in some way with this. Again, of course, if you wanted to check out any of the running back pick'ems over there on Underdog Fantasy tonight, you can find Chase Brown, higher, lower, 88.5 total yards over there on Underdog. Plus, you can find Derrick Henry, higher, lower, 90.5 rushing yards on Underdog Fantasy. The link's going to be in the description, comment section. Code FLOCK will give you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll be getting a free Lamar Jackson pick, more than less than half total yard for the game tonight. And you'll be getting a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night. Just make sure you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your Underdog Fantasy account. That way I know who to credit that free team review voucher to. But thank you again. I really appreciate you. Really hope we are able to help you out in some way here. And really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.